Stonewalling is when we are angry with the other person and we are consciously choosing not to say anything to punish them. Whenever we just go silent, it brings up fear, and what comes up over fear is usually anger, or sometimes it brings up hurt. When we love someone, we don't make them wrong. When we love someone, we tell them how we feel and why we feel the way we do, and help them to understand. Welcome to another episode of Rich in Relationship, and today we're talking about the silent treatment, the unspoken language. Dun dun dun. And look, we've all experienced the silent treatment. We've probably all dished it out at one time or another, and there's a lot of behaviors that are mistaken as the silent treatment also. So we're going to talk about what is it, what does it mean, what are some of these other things that can get confused for that, and when is it appropriate to be silent, to go silent? Like, when is it better for your relationship? So we all know what the silent treatment is, right? You say something, the other person gets upset, they cross their arms, and they don't say anything. They walk around ignoring you. And I got to tell you that I get accused of this a lot of times. Sometimes I'm just thinking about something, or I might have an ear pod in my ear and I'm listening to something, and my wife thinks I'm giving her the silent treatment. And she says, "Hey, did you notice that I'm talking to you?" Right? And I'm like, "What? Huh?" Right? So sometimes we look like we're giving someone the silent treatment, we're not. But what's interesting is the reaction it triggers in other people. And I think what it comes down to is this. When we love people, we're all there for them. When we're angry or hateful of people, it's usually because we feel they betrayed our love in some way, or they should be giving it to us. But when we get completely ignored, it's as if we have no value. And I think that's why the silent treatment, or even being mistaken for giving the silent treatment, is so painful and so triggering for other people. Some people have called the silent treatment stonewalling. Some people call it boundary setting. The question really is, first, what's the motive for it? And second, by looking at the motive, we can start to look at what is it really. So for some people, the silent treatment is defense mechanism. They feel overwhelmed by the situation. When our amygdala is triggered, we have three reactions: fight, flight, or play dead. For people who are overwhelmed, this is the equivalent of play dead. It's when something is so emotionally overwhelming or out of context in terms of their life experience that the only thing they know how to do is to be silent. They just don't know what to say. They don't even know what words to find, right? Is that stonewalling? Not so sure. Stonewalling is really when we're actively engaged in being silent, not unconsciously shut off. Is this setting a boundary? It might be a form of unconscious boundary setting, or it might just be our mind pausing until it can reset. It's kind of overloaded. It's like when you've given a computer too many commands and it needs to reboot. What's another motivation? Another motivation, still in the world of the amygdala, might be flight. It might be that we're really scared. So they've said some things, and we've become really frightened, and we're not going to say anything for fear that we're going to invite more of the same. This is not the same as setting a boundary. I want to be really clear. We're going to talk more about that in a couple of minutes. This is an unconscious or possibly conscious reaction to being really terrified. And it's not unusual with couples for, particularly when men get angry, for women to shut down, because men are historically and therefore culturally defined as protectors. And when the protector turns on those that he is protecting, it's scary for them. It's like, it's kind of like if you have dogs, if you've ever had a big dog, and I've had some big dogs, and the dog gets really freaked out and barks and growls at you and looks like it's going to bite you, that's scary. No comment on what you should do in that situation. Let's stick to husbands and wives. But men can have this, can be afraid of the anger of women also. If a man has grown up in a household where there was a lot of anger and a lot of abuse, then they can also have this reaction. It may send them back into a childhood experience of trauma, where they had a very rageful parent. Let's say it's a rageful female parent. And the trauma of that experience is such that when their wife starts yelling at them, it brings up the feeling of trauma from the past, and the man can shut down and be very, very afraid. So that's flight, play dead, and now let's talk about anger. This is what stonewalling really is. Stonewalling is when we are angry with the other person and we are consciously choosing not to say anything to punish them. Right, so that's the fight part, and the insidious kind of fight. Instead of coming out and fighting straight up, what we know that the most painful thing for that person is to be met with silence, to not be heard, to be turned away from. And so out of spite or anger, we decide that we're going to give them the silent treatment. And some people will give other people the silent treatment for days. The first two are situational and might go on for minutes or even hours. But the third can go on for days, right? And this is true stonewalling, the real silent treatment. Let me tell you, none of these are really healthy or good for a relationship. And the response in the other person, since being met with silence is the equivalent of being shut out, not even receiving hostility directly, it can be very damaging for the relationship. All three responses can be very damaging for the relationship because the other person will not receive it well. Even if they are being abusive, it's not going to be helpful. It's going to make it worse in some way, shape, or form. So let me tell you about a couple. I'm going to call them for today Sarah and Mark. And Mark was, just as I was describing, he grew up in a household where his mom and his grandmother were both really angry, rageful women, and they had learned to stand up for themselves by being angry and rageful. They had some angry and rageful men in their lives. And so Mark grew up afraid of women, and he got married to Sarah. And Sarah would periodically get really upset and start screaming. And now she wasn't like a rageaholic, but it brought up in Mark a response as if she were. Mark he would just shut down immediately because that's what worked with the women in his life when he was a child. If he just kept his head low and stayed quiet, eventually they'd stop yelling and go away and it would all get better. But that didn't work with Sarah. Sarah would say, "Why are you stonewalling me? What's going on?" Right? And Mark realized that something needed to change because their relationship was getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, the more he went silent, the more the incidence of Sarah getting upset would come up because she felt he was avoiding the problem. She felt he wasn't engaging. She's trying to have a discussion about what's not working in their relationship and then blowing up in frustration, and he's just terrified from the get-go and not talking about it at all, and it's just spiraling out of control. So Mark is another guy who came to our Unbreakable Husband program, and he learned that his silence was a form for him of trying to control the situation, and that it was very triggering for his wife. And he learned that he had some passive-aggressive behavior going on she was not receiving well. And Mark started to work on himself in the program. And the first thing that Mark learned how to do was he learned how to set a boundary. All right, so now let's talk about boundaries. So Mark said, "Hey, what do I do? Sarah is now in the habit of yelling and screaming at me, and I just don't think it's okay. And sometimes she does it in front of the kids, and I don't want to get into a fight with her about it, but I know that being silent isn't working." And so Mark learned to set a boundary for himself into those circumstances. Now, a boundary is something we do for ourselves to make ourselves feel safe. It is not something we do to change the other person. So the boundary that Mark needed to set for himself was, yes, he couldn't hang out for what he felt was abusive anger. And so when Sarah would get that angry, Mark would say to her, Sarah, I'm getting upset. I'm going to leave. Go to the bathroom, do some meditation, take a walk, and let's resume this conversation in an hour or a day or tonight or when the kids are asleep. And you know, when I'm feeling calmer and we're both feeling calmer. And Sarah was actually able to receive that, right? Because instead of getting the silent treatment, instead of Mark shutting down, he wasn't giving her the silent treatment really. Instead of Mark shutting down and not knowing what to say, she finally understood that something was happening there, that he was feeling angst. And with the promise that he would return, she was able to back down. And if she wasn't able to back down, it didn't really matter. On the time, like when he first did it, he said, she said, what do you mean? You're just going silent on me again. He said, no. I promise you we'll talk about this, but I really need to go. And he just walked out. He just left. And that had a less than positive impact on her. He's just walking out. But it wasn't the silent treatment. It was a clear boundary. And when he returned, she understood that he wasn't just running away, that he really was willing to talk about whatever it was that she wanted to talk to him about, as long as they were both calm. And in fact, as Mark did more of the inner work, he said to her, hey, Sarah, let me explain to you. You know, when I was a kid, my mom used to yell at me all the time, and she learned that from her mom. And when I would go stay with grandma, she would do the same thing. And it's just really triggering for me. And that's why I've been going silent. And it's not about you. And she had like this light bulb moment. Oh, I get it. Right? And they both knew that kind of conversation just wasn't going to work for them anymore. You know, but it took a while, because the emotional impact of all those times when he shut down was that she felt that he was ignoring her. She felt that he was avoiding her. She felt that he was shutting her out. You know, and she had her own stuff from her childhood that led to that thinking that she got to work on later on and bring out in other conversations. All right, so the impact of the silent treatment of stonewalling is not positive. We might do it because we feel overwhelmed. We might do it because we are afraid. Or we might do it out of anger and spite. But the impact on the other person is never good. Whenever we just go silent, it brings up fear. And what comes up over fear is usually anger. Or sometimes it brings up hurt and fear and anger. And so we want to be conscious of how our conversation or lack of conversation is impacting the other person. We want to get in the habit of communicating what's going on. You know, even the person who is overwhelmed, when faced with the situation again, will not necessarily be overwhelmed. Overwhelm is a response that can be changed. So going back to that person who's overwhelmed, when they go back and reflect, talk to a coach or a therapist about it, or meditate on it, or think about it, they can go, oh, wow, I was overwhelmed. Maybe how I need to deal with that situation is to say, hey, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go reset, right? Just acknowledge what's happening and acknowledge it to the other person. That's not boundary setting. That's just saying, hey, this is what's going on. I can't handle this. It is a form of boundary setting, but it's less premeditated than what we were talking about in the case of Sarah and Mark. The person who's afraid, they need to consciously set a boundary like Mark did. But what about the person who's angry? That's the person who is actively engaging in the silent treatment. That is a whole nother ball of wax. And I think that what needs to happen there is when we need to look at what is it that we really want, right? What is our long-term goal in the relationship? If our long-term goal is to dissolve the marriage, then by all means, let's engage in the silent treatment and be destructive.
The problem with divorce is not knowing the territory. When we know the territory, it's easier to make choices. Well, we've created the divorce guide for you. This is a free ebook that's going to help you learn the territory and help you to make better decisions. And all you need to do is go to bit.ly/The Divorce Guide. Just one word, The Divorce Guide. bit.ly/The Divorce Guide. Get it now.
Actually, I wouldn't even advise that. If our long-term goal is to dissolve the marriage and there's children involved, we still need to cut out anything that's super negative. And so maybe there are some issues we have with what's coming at us. Maybe there's something we need to look at about how we're willing to engage in a behavior that we know is triggering to the other person for days at a time to punish them. Maybe we need to look at our own desire to control, our own desire to belittle, to berate, to attempt to change the other person through our own angry, premeditated response. So there's something to be learned there. And usually people who do that learned that somewhere else, by the way. We don't come up with these strategies all on our own. 99.9% of the strategies in life were learned somewhere else. And so maybe we need to look at, where did we learn that? Did it work then? It certainly isn't working now. We need to look at, how can we, even when we're in that state and when we're getting really angry, what's the boundary that we need to set so that we can have time to process our anger? Because here's the fact of the matter, what we've discovered in the Unbreakable Husband program is that any kind of angry interaction that involves yelling and screaming, 9 times out of 10 is not going to go in a positive direction. We need to find other ways to process those emotions without bashing our loved one's head in. Because when we love someone, we don't treat them that way. When we love someone, we don't make them wrong. When we love someone, we tell them how we feel and why we feel the way we do and help them to understand. And when they love you, they understand, have that light bulb moment that Sarah had, and they shift and they change. And vice versa. That's like a two-way street, right? That's how real relationships where people are learning and growing together, work. But it can only happen in communication. It can't happen in silence, right? Learning about the other person, changing and growing, meeting them part way, that can only happen in a conversation. And the silent treatment is the antithesis of a conversation. So listen, I want to thank you for tuning in today. And I want to encourage you to reflect on, where and when do you go silent and why? All right. Are you having a fight, flight, or run away? Fight, flight, or play dead response? Fight, flight, or play dead response? What habitually, what do you do? Right. So a lot of our communication habits were created in childhood. Think about this stuff. Reflect on it. Reach out and let us know what's going on with you. DM me. Let me know what's happening. Hey, and if you're a man or you know a man who wants to save their marriage, we are launching, like through 2024, a whole series of free live challenges for men who want to change themselves to change their marriage. It's just free information because we want to change 10,000 marriages with our Unbreakable Husband program. So check it out. No obligation. Hey, I want you to recommend this podcast to your family and friends you think might benefit from it. Subscribe, leave a review, provide us with any kind of feedback that you might have. Check out our Instagram feed. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, you name it. And we're going to continue this series on behaviors that are inhibiting the growth of your marriage, so that you can continue to grow and thrive. Thank you so much.